Hello, it's Carol Graham from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and I'm here to talk to you today about a new science of well-being, which is basically the study of happiness. I've studied happiness around the world, but we have now developed it into a real science where we can understand the determinants of well-being and also what well-being implies in terms of behavior, and what that might imply for your topic, which is city livability, smart growth, how cities develop. And I think the metrics we're developing may be quite useful both for understanding some of the questions that you all are trying to understand and then also for some of the policy questions you're trying to answer. So what I thought I'd do today is talk a bit about the development of this science, tell you a little bit about the metrics and what we can measure, some puzzles that also come out of that, and then very quickly how I think it can be applied to policies that are relevant to urban livability. So this science began as a few crazy outlier economists like myself working with psychologists about 10 to 15 years ago, combining the methods of economists, large-scale econometric surveys, with the methods of economists using survey data, listening to what people say basically, in combining the two approaches to understand the determinants of human happiness and human well-being. Initially, we were seen to be slightly crazy, and maybe we still are, but since then, the interest in the topic and in the metrics has exploded. We've gone from having happiness panels at Davos, I was on one at the World Economic Forum about a year ago, to having Jeff Sachs calling for happiness as the 9th Millennium Development Goal and having a UN General Assembly meeting on the topic, to the British government putting well-being metrics into its statistics, closer to home to the Australians having a well-being index measuring well-being in Australia across the country and over time, to the US even having a National Academy of Sciences panel, which is, I'm part of that panel, tasked with recommending which metrics we should be using in our statistics, US statistics, to measure well-being. So we've gone from being a group of remote, crazy outliers to being front and center in a lot of economic and policy debates. And I hope some of this is relevant to the questions of your conference. So first of all, let me just show you a slide that may help sort of drive home why these metrics matter. This is happiness and GDP per capita across a whole cross-section of countries. I wish Australia was on this slide. I'll make sure it is next time I do this. But what you see from this slide is that there is some relationship between income per capita, which is on the horizontal axis, and reported well-being or happiness, which is on the vertical axis, but the relationship is far from straightforward. This particular scatter plot is the subject of a great amount of debate among economists. It's something called the Easterlin paradox, which shows that as countries get wealthier over time, they don't necessarily get happier. And also, even when you look across countries, as in this slide, there's not a clear linear relationship. Surely the wealthy countries are happier than the poorer countries, but there's a lot more variance than you would expect if you simply took standard economics at face value and thought that income was the key to well-being or happiness. What explains this? Lots of different things. One is simply cultural differences in the way people in different countries answer surveys. These are average scores, so those cultural differences are not taken out econometrically. They're just averaged into a country score. So you see, for example, the French are slightly more curmudgeonly than the Dutch. You see in the developing countries that the Latin American countries, I'm from Peru, the Latin American countries are typically more cheerful and happy than their income levels would predict, and then other countries, particularly some of the Eastern European countries, are less happy than their income levels would predict. But most importantly, you also see that countries with really bad levels of freedom, with bad public goods and other things like that, score very low. So one thing that this slide picks up is that there are unobservable differences across countries that income doesn't fully capture. And if you think about cities and livability, there's some very wealthy cities that are really difficult to live in, lots of pollution, lots of commuting time, lots of things that make living there unpleasant, and there are other cities that are much more livable. And again, it has to do with public goods and lots of other things that aren't necessarily picked up by income measures. So that's sort of the cross-country explanation. When we look at the individual level, we're able to be much more precise, and we're able to really establish what the determinants of human well-being are. I've studied this around the world, and there are remarkably consistent patterns in what makes people happy across countries, cultures, and time. So this particular slide tends to interest people because they can place themselves on it. This is happiness by age level. It's controlling for health and being in a stable partnership, both of which are very important for well-being. But if you can see, your 20s and 30s aren't it. Actually, happiness and age have a U-shaped relationship, which bottoms out in the middle age years. It depends a little bit by country. It varies by a year or 2 or 3, but it's always somewhere in the mid to late 40s, the sort of low point in happiness. And then people get actually happier as they age, as long as they're healthy. What explains this? Lots of different things. The middle age squeeze, both in terms of finances, dependent children, dependent parents. There's an aspirations aligning with realities effect. If you don't know what you're going to be when you grow up by the mid-40s, you probably should. But mainly also, as people age, they get more philosophical. They learn to enjoy life more. As long as they're healthy, they're more appreciative of the years they have. And you can see it goes all the way up the ladder. I tend to joke with this slide and say that, our oldest respondent in this particular sample, Latin America, was 99, and there may be a senility effect, but I will leave that to you. But mainly the most important thing to take from this slide is that this pattern between happiness and age is consistent across the world, around the world, countries all over the world, regardless of their development levels, regardless of, there's a consistent determinant. And we find that with several other things. For example, we find that the age relationship holds. Income does matter. Within countries, wealthier people are happier than poor people, anywhere you look at it. It doesn't mean that more and more money makes people happier, but it does mean that being destitute, not being able to afford the things you need, not being able to give the children the things they need, is bad for well-being. Health matters a tremendous amount. It's more important than income, actually, in our equations. Employment status, very consistent across countries and cultures. Anywhere we study it, people who are unemployed that would like to be gainfully employed are less happy on average than others. There are all kinds of other things you could highlight, but those are the basic variables. And understanding those very consistent variables across countries and over time then lets us measure things that vary. We can look at, for example, controlling for these stable patterns. Does inequality make people happy or unhappy? Does commuting time make people happier or unhappier? Does air pollution make people happier or unhappier? We can test a whole lot of things about people's environment or the activities they partake in, such as exercising or smoking or whatever it may be, and look at the effects of those things on their well-being. So if you're trying to understand the quality of life in particular cities, one can imagine that well-being metrics could be very useful. You could be looking at the effects of commuting time, of pollution, of all kinds, using public transportation or not. All of these things we could measure with well-being. So at one level, these metrics are very powerful, and they're letting us look into any number of things that affect people's quality of life around the world, in cities, in rural areas, in different countries of different levels of development. And at some level, the world is our oyster. But I don't want to make it seem too easy, and let me point to a puzzle that we also find, which is the adaptation puzzle. People are remarkably able to adapt to both increasing levels of prosperity and not increase their happiness, as that cross-country slide showed, but also to extreme adversity. We find, for example, that people in Afghanistan, depending on which dimension of well-being we measure, are as happy as people in Latin America, even though objective conditions are much worse in Afghanistan than they are in Latin America. We find that crime and corruption are terrible for well-being everywhere we look at it, but people who are accustomed to more crime and corruption are less bothered by it. It affects their well-being less. So the point is, if you live with more crime and corruption around you, and I've studied this in Afghanistan, Latin America, Africa, that it bothers you less. What the norm is for crime and corruption matters to how much it matters to your well-being. The same goes for health. We find people in Kenya are as satisfied with their health as people in the United States, which makes no objective sense from a health standards point of view. But if you think of people adapting to different norms of health, then it starts to make more sense. We also find that different health conditions matter more or less to people depending on if people around them have the same health conditions, like obesity. Obesity is bad for well-being, but it bothers you less if there are more obese people around you. And the point of that is that as people adapt to all these things and they tolerate sort of bad equilibrium, you can see how people basically adapt to unpleasant certainty. And that can go also for bad city living. Indeed, we find that people are much better able to adapt to unpleasant certainty than they are to uncertainty, even uncertainty that's associated with positive progress. We've discovered something called the paradox of unhappy growth. People in very rapidly growing countries are actually less happy on average than people in slower growing ones. It doesn't mean that the per capita income levels don't matter, but controlling for those, a lot of change and uncertainty is bad for well-being. Let me show you a last slide, and then I'll conclude with some policy recommendations. But this is a very marked example of not being able to adapt to uncertainty. This is the U.S. during the recent financial crisis. The red line is average levels of well-being or happiness in the U.S., and the blue line is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. As you can see, we interviewed 1,000 Americans a day. This is with a Gallup organization. As you can see, as the crisis hit, starting in early 2009, well-being levels fell dramatically. Indeed, that red line was an 11% drop to the bottom in average national happiness for the United States. Average happiness levels didn't increase at all with 3 decades of rapid growth, and yet they fell 11% in 6 months of dire economic uncertainty. And then what happens? When the bottom starts falling out of the markets, once the markets stabilize, well-being levels actually recovered to higher than they were before the crisis. The same people report their economic situation to be worse than before. But what has happened? People can adapt to unpleasant certainty, having lost some income, much better than they could cope with the uncertainty of not knowing how much they'd lose. And I've seen this in patterns and patterns around the world, where people can adapt to bad equilibrium, such as extreme poverty, lots of crime and corruption, bad health, as long as it's certain. And so if you think about cities and smart growth and city livability, obviously there are cities all over the world where people just deal with lots of traffic, lots of pollution, lots of corruption, lots of bad things, and adapt to it. Well-being metrics can help us understand both the effects of those things on well-being, but also the extent to which people have sort of just adapted to a bad equilibrium, and you're going to need more change to make things better. So lastly, on policy, I'm very involved in the policy debates for the U.S., which metrics should go in our statistics. We're very careful about what dimension of well-being we're measuring. We can measure well-being in what I call the Benthamite sense, how people experience their daily lives, look at the quality of lives as they go through it. And then we can also measure well-being in what I call the Aristotelian sense, which is people's life purpose, their evaluations of their lives as a whole. And this latter measure really captures people's opportunities to choose what they want to do with their lives. So they're very different measures. I think in terms of the City Liveabilities project, understanding how people are experiencing their daily lives in the cities in which they live is probably a very obvious application. But I also think that our ability to measure people's ability to lead fulfilling lives, creative lives, and how that links to the city they live in is another element that these metrics could provide. And maybe just a last note on the use of the metrics. We certainly do not purport to replace GNP metrics or replace income-based measures. Rather, these metrics are most useful when they complement income-based measures and can inform policy decisions at the margin. They can help us understand how a policy might affect well-being. They can help us evaluate how a policy is affecting well-being during its implementation, and they can also help us assess over the long run changes in those patterns. And let me close with a recent example from the British government's use of these metrics that might maybe be a good way to think about how we can what kind of information these metrics help us or provide for us or provide for policymakers. There was a proposal recently in Britain to close all of the rural post offices. And from a budget standpoint, it made sense. Rural post offices don't deliver much mail. They're expensive to keep up. There's sort of the cost-benefit analysis yields a very, very low benefit to high cost of keeping these post offices open. Well, well-being metrics showed that the visit to the rural post office was the most important part of the day for isolated rural respondents, particularly elderly ones, and that the social components of visiting the post office was very important to rural people's health and well-being. Now, it doesn't mean that you make the decision only on the basis of the well-being metrics, but it does make you think about the cost-benefit analysis very differently when you realize that closing all these post offices might have been actually devastating for the well-being of many rural people across Britain. So that's one example. One can think of many others in terms of decisions about city policies, urban policies, growth policies, where these metrics could hopefully be very useful to the kinds of decisions that are made based on a broader base of information, understanding the potential well-being effects of particular proposals. So I'll close with that. I wish you all a good conference and look forward to hearing the results of it as well. Thank you.